Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ruminate This with Agrarian Solutions. Join us as we explore ruminant nutrition and the impact of mycotoxins. Here, we challenge your curiosity and explore new industry insights and research to optimize your herd's health and performance. Hey, everybody. This is Scott Zier, your host of Ruminate This with Agrarian Solutions. One of our goals with Ruminate This is to try to keep the content between 20 and 30 minutes so you guys can get through this in a timely fashion. Today's episode, on the other hand, is going to be a little bit longer. We're about 42 minutes, and I just wanted to give you that heads up going into it. As we did our editing, we realized that there was an awful lot of gold in the conversation that we had today with Dr. Larry Roth. And as we dove into the different mycotoxins and how they affect our cattle. So stick with us. I think there'll be a lot of good stuff, and appreciate you taking the time to listen to Ruminate This with Agrarian Solutions. All right. Welcome, everybody, to Ruminate This with Agrarian Solutions. I'm your host, Scott Zier, and glad to be back for episode number 6 today. And today we're going to be talking with Dr. Larry Roth, Vice President of Nutrition here at Agrarian Solutions. Once again, Larry, thanks for jumping on with us. And we're going to dive into our sampling program, our mycophile testing program, talk a little bit about what mycotoxins we're sampling for, and then go through with some detail with Dr. Roth on kind of the unique characteristics of each one. Larry, is it fair to say that each one of these toxins has its own mode of action and also unique things that they do to challenge that cow?
You bet. Each of them is a little bit different, but they share a lot of things in common.
Yes, they do. One of the things that I want to dive into with you too, Larry, is, so there's cause and effect of different toxins, right? And there's some maybe things that a toxin like Zearalenone will affect directly, but there's also things, I'll use DON or Vomitoxin, for example. It may affect some of those same things as Zearalenone, but more in an indirect manner. And we're going to dive into some of those nuances today with Dr. Roth here on Ruminate This. So if you're enjoying the podcast so far, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Share this with people that you think would find value in these podcast calls. If you're in the dairy industry, the beef industry, nutritionist, veterinary, herd manager, herd owner, cattle rancher, this is the place for you. Larry, I'm going to start out with our sampling program just to kind of give an overview. There's 17 different toxins we're sampling for, correct?
Correct. Yep.
So how did we come up with those 17 that we want to routinely test for?
Well, because that's what labs are commonly set up to test for. Different folks will say there's somewhere around 1,000 different mycotoxins that cause issues, but we commonly see there's a big 5. And so that's what labs are testing for. And then there's some more that we might say are in that second level. So that's, ironically enough, what labs are set up to test for.
So, Larry, what exactly is a mycotoxin, just to kind of set the table for us?
Okay, great question. A mycotoxin is a poison. How's that? So the molds, there's different molds that will produce mycotoxins, and all they're trying to do is keep other microorganisms from living in their environment, living in their neighborhood. These molds that produce mycotoxins, these poisons, could care less about a cow or a steer. They could care less. Our animals are just collateral damage. So when the mold is on a corn plant, for example, and it gets stressed because it's too hot and dry or it's cool and wet, it says, hey, I got to survive. I got to have another generation. So I'm going to make a poison that keeps other molds and in certain situations, bacteria from living in this environment. So it's fancy term, competitive exclusion. Scott, I just like to say, don't live in my neighborhood, and if you come here, I'm going to poison you. That's what the molds are doing.
Remind me to never move to Minnesota.
There you
go. So essentially, a mycotoxin is that natural defense mechanism for that mold to. Okay. With that, there's different types of molds, right? They produce different types of toxins. but there's certain molds that maybe, I'm going to say like Fusarium seems to be a lot of different toxins that are produced from Fusarium. And then you have the penicillium molds, which can create toxins that cause issues that we know about in cattle. But you mentioned the big five, and I think everybody listening to this has probably heard, at least they know some of these toxins, but we're going to go back, Larry. There's a saying that I've heard you use before. If I were to ask you in 1992, name a mycotoxin.
Aflatoxins.
So tell us about aflatoxin.
Yeah, aflatoxin. So we associate aflatoxin with drought conditions. It's hot and it's dry. And for a long time, that was kind of conditions we had in certain parts of the United States, most notably in the Southeast. We would grow corn, for example, and we'd start out with a good growing season, but then it would get hot and it would quit raining. So the Fusarium mold, which generally produces aflatoxin, would get stressed and it would make the aflatoxin. But we also know that there are some penicillium molds that will also produce aflatoxin. So there's so many different molds. And what we're going to be doing today, Scott, is mentioning some of these mold names, and we're doing their genus. And then there's also different species. But what's interesting about aflatoxin is,
Well, it's a carcinogen, right?
Yeah, it's a carcinogen. So the aflatoxin is produced on the plant. We'll use corn as an example because that's where, in the United States, at least, most of our mycotoxins are found: corn grain or corn silage. So we've got the plant that is stressed. The aflatoxin is there, and we feed that corn grain. Primarily, aflatoxin was showing up in pigs and chickens because that's what it was being fed to in the Southeast U.S. But the aflatoxin could be absorbed by humans that consume either the animal products that came from an animal that obviously consumed the aflatoxin, or from milk, a cow that had consumed the aflatoxin, and then it would get converted when it's into the human. And with cows, they would consume aflatoxin B, for trivia for you, and it's converted over to aflatoxin M, and that's the carcinogen. And we don't like to be creating cancer, so FDA limits aflatoxin levels in feedstuffs as well as in the milk. So that was our big concern for a long time. Aflatoxin, carcinogen, has very negative effects on liver, and yeah, we had drought conditions. But fortunately, our plant breeder friends are now making more drought-tolerant corn, and we don't see as much aflatoxin. A possible exception could be with peanuts and cotton, again, coming from the Southeast. But lately, we've been using so many different fungicides on peanuts and cotton that even in drought conditions, we don't see as much aflatoxin. So where would we see it? Let's say we got somebody who stores in peanut meal or whole cotton seed out of the Southeast or a drought-prone area. They might be wanting to see some aflatoxin. But boy, I'll tell you what, I just don't see aflatoxin these days.
Yeah, we don't run into it.
Yeah.
No. And so aflatoxin is, if I understand all my research I've done on these things, if you were to ask a nutritionist, name or what kind of a product would you use to take care of mycotoxins, many of them would say binders. So there's actually some correlation to the story behind L-form bacteria and our mode of action, and why we like to say, hey, we're not a binder, but we work in the mycotoxin arena. But there's a correlation between when we had all these aflatoxin concerns, and actually binders are a pretty good option for aflatoxin, correct?
Oh, just about anything is a good binder for aflatoxin because of its chemical structure and so forth. Anything that we dig out of the ground, clays, yeast cell walls, active charcoal, all of these things will bind aflatoxin. So that's where people got the idea. If we have mycotoxins, put that in air quotes, you got a binder to protect ourselves.
Yep.
But unfortunately, with changes in our climate, we're seeing more cool, wet conditions. So now our focus is on other types of mycotoxins. We need different protection methods in a simple binder as if our concern was aflatoxin.
Right. And which is a good segue to lead into some of these other toxins, these fusarium mold toxins that we're kind of going to dive into initially. And, the one I'm going to go to next, Larry, to talk about is one we see, I would say, more than anything, which is DON, or
Mhm.
vomitoxin as it's called.
Mhm.
And unlike aflatoxin, which has a strong, positive molecular charge, Don, not so much. And that's where we kind of see where, the binder approach starts to really wear off in its ability to bind up these toxins. So, Don is one we get to talk about a lot on farm. We get to talk with nutritionists, with veterinaries all over the country. And it's probably, I think from the, concern level perspective, Larry, I'm going to say it's the most controversial. So, at what level of Don is causing issues, right?
Well,
And that's where I, kind of think of it that way. So tell us a little bit about Don, and then let's dive into maybe what are some of the side effects, if you would.
you bet. So we associate dawn with fusarium moles, and they get stressed because it's cool and wet. We have a delayed harvest situation, or it can be nice and warm, but still it's very wet. And, a lot of these molds like to live in organic matter, and with modern farming practices, we have more organic matter, especially on the surface. And molds need oxygen to live. So, wow, modern farming practices created almost an ideal environment for fusarium and psyllium type molds. So, Dawn, scientific word for you, messes up ruminal fermentation.
Yep.
Again, we go back to toxins are poisons to try and keep other organisms from growing. And Dawn tends to reduce our good starch fermenters and fiber fermenters in the rumen. So consequently, we have nutrients that flow down the river on the digestive tract and get metabolized by other organisms, pathogenic organisms, and we get hindgut fermentation and bad things happen.
Is
Dawn
it
can also kill, I'll go ahead and say kill because it's a poison, cause some cell death in the small intestine. We think of the small intestine lining as being like the castle wall that keep the bad guys, the barbarians, in the digestive tract and out of the body. So Dawn messes up ruminal fermentation, goes on down to the small intestine, causes a break in the castle wall. And now we got Dawn floating around the body, and the animal's immune system has to go and defeat this poison so that it doesn't cause bad things in the animal.
so when we're when we're on farms that are dealing with Don, and you just said it, right? That hindgut fermentation.
Mhm.
To pay homage to one of our former colleagues, I think we would think of that as acidosis. We'd see loose manure. Maybe it's misdiagnosed as acidosis. Maybe it's Don-induced acidosis, and so along with that, though, what are if we're having high Don levels in our TMR and our feedstuffs beyond that hindgut fermentation or rumen efficiency? What are some other things that might be attributed to maybe chronic exposure to Don?
You bet. So, first thing that we might start to think about is we're losing nutrients that could go to more productive purposes like making milk.
Hmm.
So we have lower milk levels. That's because we got dawn and the body is trying to deal with dawn. So the immune system, the body's military is trying to defeat it. Plus, we weren't getting the fermentation that we wanted in the rumen. So milk will suffer in terms of quantity and also in terms of components. Second thing that we can often see is poor reproduction. And so
Hmm.
often we associate poor reproduction with Zearalenone, which we'll probably talk about after a while here. But the body, the animal's body is just set up that first priority is stay alive.
Yep.
So immune system comes into play. Then it starts thinking about growing with the first lactation cow. So maybe we have poor growth once the animal freshens, this first lactation. Then we start to see poorer milk quantity and components. Then lastly comes reproduction. Well, why would reproduction suffer? Well, again, what's standing last in line for nutrients? Reproduction. And most notably, glucose. Where's glucose get produced? In the liver. Well, the liver has a big role in detoxifying mycotoxins. So if we're causing issues for liver health, because we have, I'm not going to say high levels, but significant levels of mycotoxins, including DON to get rid of, now the liver is impaired for making glucose. So we go down our biochemistry route here. Glucose is used for making lactose. Lactose levels are closely regulated in milk by the body. So no glucose, no lactose, no milk. Glucose is also important as a carbon source for rapidly developing follicles. So if we see poorer first service conception rates, well, maybe that's because we're not getting the follicle development, follicle health that we want, because we're not getting glucose produced, because we had poorer rumen health. We didn't get the fermentation we wanted. We didn't get glucose produced by the liver because we had issues there. We also have glucose going over as a fuel for the body's military, the immune system, and consequently standing last in line are the follicles saying, hey, where's my glucose so that I can grow?
Yep.
So it's all kind of a cascade, if you want to think of it that way, of what's going on. Cell death, mycotoxins get into the body. Immune system has to go defeat them. That's a diversion of nutrients. Mycotoxins go to the liver, cause issues there. We don't get nutrients, not only glucose produced, but also amino acids, and consequently things suffer. And right there, Scott, that little sequence of events applies to all of the mycotoxins to one degree or another.
It does. And, like I mentioned in the beginning, right? There's things we think about with each one of these toxins as a direct, because of their mode of action, the direct challenge that it presents, but also this chain of events. I mean, it's not hard to follow, what you just said and connect the dots because it's just the way it is, right? We don't really think of DON, which is that rumen efficiency killer, if you would, as causing elevated somatic cell. But if that immune system is working overtime to fight off the negative effects of DON because of that cell death, and she's not absorbing the amount of nutrients she should because of that hindgut fermentation and inflammation in there and cell death. Well, that makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
So you made reference to Zearalenone. Larry, I know you might want to have a little fun with me and try to stump me on something. I'm going to tell you to pick a different one because Zearalenone is one that, having spent a number of years on the back end of the cow, if you would, I paid a lot of attention to this one. It started out because I was breeding cows on a dairy that we were seeing an awful lot of cows in the dry cow pen and in the pregnant cow pen that were jumping and standing like they were in heat.
Mm-hmm.
So, the cow gets put on vet check, and then the vet says, why am I arming cows that are pregnant? Well, we just saw her standing in heat. Little did I know at the time, but Zearalenone has a very similar chemical makeup as does estrogen.
Mm-hmm.
And am I right in saying that when the cow consumes it, her body actually recognizes it as estrogen?
Exactly. It binds to the estrogen receptors. and then we get the poor reproductive success, short cycles, all of those bad things start to happen. But also, zearalenone can cause death to some of the intestinal cells, and we just went through that sequence of events. So again, if we go back 30, 40 years ago, people would have said aflatoxin and then zearalenone and associate it with poor reproductive success because of its estrogen-like properties. But we know it also comes into play from diverting nutrients. What's interesting is so often we see Dawn and zearalenone traveling along hand in hand together.
Yep.
So when would we have Dawn? When we see loose manure, again, the hindgut fermentation.
Yep.
When would we see zearalenone? When reproductive success really suffers.
Yep.
And again, so they're so related together. And you were talking about levels, making a reference to that earlier. Well, we can say a certain level of Dawn is going to cause issues. Well, what happens if zearalenone is there also?
Yeah.
What happens if some of the other mycotoxin levels are present? Well, then the level of Dawn to cause issues drops. And, there's a whole long list of things like cystic cows that get associated with zearalenone and so forth. But so often that is when we have high levels. I think the big problem with these mycotoxins is not the high levels, it's the medium levels to we're kind of borderline high and causing, again, the intestinal death, liver problems, immune issues, and diversion of nutrients.
I think you're right about that. I think it's less and less am I of the belief that, not saying we haven't seen it. I think you and I could identify a farm a year ago that we were on that they were struggling with some acute toxin problems where they got into a bunk that was just extremely high in Don, very high in zearalenone. But to me, I think it's the chronic, long-term, low-level where, it's and if you're a dairyman listening to this, I like to ask the question, well, when's the last time you really felt like the herd was performing the way it should, genetically speaking and nutritionally speaking? Oftentimes, you'll hear things like, well, 5, 6 months ago, we were making 2, 3 pounds more milk. Well, okay, so maybe that's 93 pounds of milk. Well, do you feel like you should have been making 98, 100? Where do you think your genetic potential is? And Larry, I'm not sure we know what these cows are truly capable of. Because I don't think we've really figured out a lot of these toxins and how they interact.
So I think that what you just said is important, how they interact. Because again, rarely is it just one that shows up because it's similar molds. So many of them are fusarium, many of them are penicillium. It's similar conditions that cause the mold to produce the poison, and it's similar ones. So you're just mentioning some numbers for milk production. Scott, let's simplify it. We think we should be at 100 pounds of milk. Well, if we're having cell death in the intestine, we're having liver issues, we're having nutrients diverted over to support the immune system, for the sake of argument, we're losing 2% of our nutrients right there. They're diverted away to non-productive purposes. I mean, we can argue that the immune system is productive, but really what we're measuring is what's milk production, what's reproductive success. That's what we're measuring. So if we have 2% of our nutrients being diverted, gosh, that's 2 pounds out of 100 pounds that we ought to be getting. Doesn't seem like a lot, but hey, I'd like everybody to give me 2% of their paycheck because they're not going to miss it, right? We had a row crop farmer, and he was hauling corn or soybeans to town, and he didn't close the bottom of that truck like he ought to, and he lost 2% of his soybeans going to town. Do you think he would close that door the next time? I think so. So it's not the big issues, the big levels that we need to be concerned about. It's these medium to kind of borderline high levels that maybe they're costing us 2 to 5%.
Yep.
Hey, if the guy who's mixing the TMR forgot to close the gate on the TMR wagon and we lost 2 to 5% of our TMR between mixing and getting it out in front of the cows, would the dairy owner be concerned about that? I think so.
I think so.
But these mycotoxins are causing a loss of 2 to 5% of the nutrients that could be going into the cows.
Yeah.
Well, one of the mycotoxins that we're starting to see a little bit of now is T2. And T2 has a very interesting history.
Yes, it does.
T2 was a big problem during World War II and period afterwards. Small grains weren't being harvested in Russia like it should have. Uncle Joe Stalin realized that it was an issue and put some microbiologists to work to come up with defenses against T2, because it was estimated that somewhere around 10% of the people in Belarus and Ukraine died from T2 poisoning. Wow, that's huge. And Scott, I hope it'll be an interesting subject for another one of these podcasts, but it was T2 that led to the discovery of the ill-formed bacteria that we're now working with. So T2 suppresses the immune system. And if we're suppressing the immune system of our cows, that's letting pathogens, be it respiratory or digestive wise, have their way. T2 also causes liver failure. And again, liver is the biochemical factory of the body, get rid of bad things and create good things. So yeah, T2, we're starting to see a little bit more of that. And again, I'm not trying to say we don't do good modern agronomic practices, but anytime we get more organic residue, we're setting ourselves up for things like T2.
Well, with T2 as well, I think of intestinal hemorrhaging. I think of that bloody diarrhea. Larry, this is just a hypothesis of mine. How many misdiagnosed cases of hemorrhagic bowel have there been?
Oh, absolutely. We used to say it was, what was it? Aspergillus fumigatus. It was from hay that was stored on the ground. Then we say it's Clostridia. Now we're understanding that maybe bloody gut is just a sign of symptoms that can cause from any number of different things.
Right.
We know that these poisons, mycotoxins, cause shifts in digestive tract bacteria. Fewer of the bacteria that produce lactic acid to keep pH down. So now we have a shift toward those organisms that like to eat the mycotoxins. Makes sense. More mycotoxins, more of the bacteria that like to eat them. And they're not the guys that produce the lactic acid. So we get more pathogens, and then we get the bloody gut that you were just mentioning. So it's rarely is it just one mycotoxin. Rarely is it just one issue. It's a whole bunch of things that come together.
Yes.
Another interesting mycotoxin is fumonisin. In the United States of America, there's only two mycotoxins that are regulated. Nationally, it's aflatoxin because, as we mentioned earlier, it's carcinogen. The other one is fumonisin in the state of Texas. Not so much for cattle, but rather for horses, because of what it does for GI tract health. So we impair digestive tract health, we get colic. And what's the big thing that all horse owners are concerned about? Colic.
Yeah.
So little trivia for you. But fumonisin also causes liver issues with cattle. And again, man, I sound like I keep repeating myself. Liver, that's the body's biochemical factory. So interesting how many of these mycotoxins are going to affect the body in the same way. They're created by the same molds. It's just what are the conditions and when do the conditions occur in the field or during storage where we get bad things happening.
Wow, there's a lot to digest, and we have a couple more that I want to bring to your mind before we start to wrap it up. But yeah, let's go. Actually, I'll go right there. Mycophenolic acid. We see that pop up not extremely consistently, but enough that we're we're keeping track of it. Talk to us about mycophenolic acid.
Yeah, mycophenolic acid produced by penicillium. And some of your listeners, their ears may have perked up when they heard mycophenolic acid because we hear of it a lot in human medicine. It's administered to people who have organ transplants
Okay.
because it suppresses the immune system. Scott,
Anti-rejection.
yeah, but what could go wrong with a
Yep.
cow that has a suppressed immune system
An awful
or a
lot.
heifer that has a suppressed immune system? But again, in certain conditions, cool, wet, the penicillium decides, hey, I'm going to make this poison, mycophenolic acid, because I don't want bacteria growing in my neighborhood. And the cow is the collateral damage.
Yep. Okay. Another one I'm going to throw at you, Larry, that is now on our assay results we get back. And I'm seeing more and more of it. And I know that, we didn't really get into this and we won't have to dive in, but we think of Don as an indicator toxin in a lot of ways, a marker toxin.
Yep.
And one that's popping up more frequently than even mycophenolic acid is Roquefortine C.
Yeah. And Roquefortine C, that's a very interesting one. Again, if we were having this conversation 20 years ago, we wouldn't even be mentioning that name.
Yeah.
And I made mention, about storage a little bit ago. And so often we think mycotoxins come when we have bad storage. We didn't fix the grain bin roof and now we got leaking. Actually, Roquefortine C can come in some of our very best silages because the penicillium that makes Roquefortine C is anaerobic. It'll grow when we don't have oxygen.
Yeah.
Most all of our other molds, they need some oxygen. So, man, Scott, you've got somebody who's doing an excellent job with their corn silage. They had some penicillium that came in with it. And man, they did a good job of packing. But our cows are having some issues, lower production than what they ought to, some reproductive failure. Well, we need to look at Roquefortine C because it shows up in some of our very best corn silages. We do everything right, and it gets created while the crop is in the bunker. So a very interesting one. And again, Roquefortine C in certain levels is okay. If you've had Roquefort type cheese or dressing or blue cheese, you probably had some Roquefortine C.
I love blue cheese, especially on my buffalo wings.
So you probably had some Roquefortine C, but it was at a low enough level that it didn't make you sick.
I'm still here.
Or if you did get sick, wow, too much Roquefortine C.
Maybe I just blamed it on the hot chicken wings that I ate, and it was really the Roquefortine C.
Could be.
The last one I want to dive into, and then I have I'm going to say a trivia question for you, Larry.
Okay.
Patulin. What, you and I had a discussion about Patulin not that long ago, more common in maybe some livestock ingredients like apple pomace.
Yeah. Patulin is very interesting. Again, it's a penicillium. It tends to be more associated with fruit than with grain crops. And here's the interesting thing about Patulin. If we have apples that start to spoil, okay, what are we going to do with them? We're not going to send them to the grocery store for table consumption. We're going to turn them into cider.
Yes.
Okay? What could go wrong with that? Well, we got the apple pomace, we got the cider. Patulin is a mycotoxin that is not changed by pasteurization. So we go to the store, we get some apple cider that is clear because it's been pasteurized. If it came from bad apples, there might be some patulin there. But hey, we got a great bargain. We got some apple pomace that we can go buy. Okay. Hey, it's going to be a good source of some carbohydrates, some sugars, maybe a little bit of soluble fiber. Maybe we want to evaluate it for patulin. Again, liver causes problems for the liver.
So
I just tanked apple cider consumption in the United States.
Well, now I was going to ask you because I was thinking about where we get our apple cider from. an orchard not far from here. They don't pasteurize it, but they UV treat it.
That UV is going to be effective for the organisms like bacteria, maybe
Right.
molds,
Probably
but
not for Patulin.
it's not going to change the poison Patulin.
Well, there we go. Larry, I have a trivia question for you, and
Yep.
this is one that over the course of my career, over the last 11 years, I've been told that this is unequivocally true, and I've also been told that that is nothing more than witchcraft and you're crazy and there's no such thing. Do cattle have the ability to store mycotoxins within their body, or do toxins have the ability to, become stored within the body? And is it
Well,
all toxins or just certain toxins?
wow, that's a fantastic trivia question, and the answer is yes. Animals have the ability to store principally zearalenone
Interesting.
in their fat tissue. So again, what could go wrong with that? So we've got, let's say, a dairy heifer that's been on some corn silage, maybe some distillers grains. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And again, what's distillers grains made from? I'm going to say mycotoxin contaminated corn, because we're not going to take it to the feed mill because they're testing for it. So the heifer is gradually putting on some body condition, right? Well, if it's been gradually absorbing some of the zearalenone, depositing that in the fat tissue, the animal freshens and starts to break down some of that body fat. And now we have zearalenone freed from the fatty tissue, and it is floating through the body to cause its mischief in the liver and again with the estrogen receptors. So yes, the body does have the ability to absorb mycotoxins, and the one that we're principally concerned about is zearalenone.
There's another discussion here about liver health post calving and all the stuff that cow has to do, and ask that liver to do, and then wow, there's a lot of stuff to think about there. So one final question for you, Larry. If we go back to episode 2 and episode 3, where we talked about our mycotoxin research we did,
Yep.
Those samples, when we did those samples during the studies, we saw Don and Zearalenone. We didn't pick up any of the other toxins we talked about. But yet, when I'm on dairies across the region I serve here, same with our colleague Chad out in Minnesota, I mean, you see it. We see all of these toxins, with the exception of probably aflatoxin, but we've seen them all. But yet, we're able to show improvements despite having T2 or despite having Vomitoxin. We know binders are effective for aflatoxin. Why is DTX specifically effective against such a broad range of toxins? And then we'll wrap up.
Great question. So how do mycotoxins get into the body? First of all, they have to get into the intestinal lining cells that are absorbed. Well, these mycotoxins are so big compared to like a glucose molecule. And we know that a glucose molecule has to be absorbed at the intestine with transport proteins.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? It doesn't happen by simple diffusion passing through the intestinal wall, the wall of the intestinal cell. So it's active transport proteins that help absorb glucose, amino acids, and vitamins. And guess what, Scott? Our mycotoxins are a little bit bigger than those nutrients. So it's active transport proteins that help to absorb these bigger molecules like the mycotoxins. That's the only way they get in. They can't go in by simple diffusion. And so if we're able to trigger, excuse me, let me back up. So we know that it's transport proteins that get things in. We also know that these intestinal cells have the ability to get garbage out, metabolites and so forth. And these metabolite molecules are not small enough to just go out by simple diffusion, like through a simple membrane. It takes active transport proteins to get the garbage out. And it's these active transport proteins that our L-form bacteria activate that take the mycotoxins out. Hey, animals, and including humans, as long as we've been here on Earth, we've been designed with these transport proteins to clean up our intestinal cells. We're designed with the ability to protect our castle wall.
Right.
The only question is, what's the level of the mycotoxins that are being absorbed by the intestinal cells, and are the transport proteins active enough to take the garbage out, take the mycotoxins out? It's that simple. It's our L-form bacteria that activate the transport proteins that get the garbage out. It's that simple. Mycotoxins are garbage. We got to get it out. And the cells are designed. So it's quite simple. So when somebody questions transport proteins, they say, okay, cool. How does the cell get rid of the metabolites that are not supposed to be there? Because otherwise that intestinal cell would be dying, right?
Right.
Oh, yeah, that's right. They got to have some way to get that out. And yeah, those molecules are too big for simple diffusion. So that's the transport proteins. So it's logical. Somehow we get these compounds in. Somehow the cell's got to get them out. It's the transport proteins. We just have to activate those transport proteins that get the stuff out of the cell. And that's what we do. And these transport proteins, there's not one for aflatoxin, one for DON, one for zearalenone. These transport proteins, they take the bad stuff out, can recognize a wide range of molecules, not just toxins, not just poisons, but other things as well.
I think, the way you described that and the way I've understood it over the last couple of years as I've gotten to know you, to simplify it in my head, it's like these transport proteins, to them, mycotoxins are nameless and faceless. They're a bad guy. They know they're a bad guy. They get them out. They don't care if it's DON. They don't care if it's zearalenone. They don't care if it's T2. And so that's how I view the broad spectrum coverage that we have versus an aflatoxin, which again is a chemical reaction, but you're targeting a negatively charged ion and they're trying to bind with a positively charged ion and remove that way. So, to me, that makes perfect sense. And hopefully we were able to clear some of that up today for our listeners. And, folks, if you're listening and you want to have more information sent to you or would like to speak to myself, Larry, fill out that contact us form at agrariansolutions.com. And it's probably in the information tab of this podcast episode as well. And we'll be glad to help you out in any way we can. Dr. Roth, I, again, appreciate you jumping on with us again today. We might have to change this to the Scott and Larry show if I keep this up. Yeah, always good visiting with you, and thanks for the insights. And yeah, we'll be chatting again soon.
All right. Hey, thanks, Scott. Enjoy it.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you for listening to Ruminate This with Agrarian Solutions. Look for our next episode in 2 weeks.